And welcome back. I'm going to ask that we charge straight into the session. It is the Power Hour, where we will mainly be discussing how to identify green skills and why to invest in green TVET. So how the session will work is that we will be asking key questions, in fact, 3 key questions regarding how we can improve the curricula to equip the students with green skills, how to monitor and evaluate social and environmental dimensions, and also whether mainstream green skills, whether we can mainstream green skills rather. We're looking at these questions through 5 main prisms, being market systems development in education programs, investments for green TVET, water scarcity as a driver for green jobs, the EU Green Deal diplomacy, and finishing off with money aspect, and that is the green bonds versus social bonds discussion. You can, of course, let us know what you think about the discussions that will take place over this next session. And we've already got our first speaker up and ready to engage you. That is Elisabet Montgomery from Sida, and we are talking about market systems development in education programs with her. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear. And let us get straight into these discussions. I mean, we've got a lot to discuss and not that time. So I'd like to ask you to first kick off by explaining to us what is this market systems development approach and how Sida works with it.
All right. Thank you very much. The market systems development or MSD for short. I always try to demystify this. It's an approach. So it's really about one way of doing good development cooperation and try new ways, exploring together with our partners what we can do better and, to achieve our goals really. To be more specific now, MSD, market systems development, is what we call a systemic approach and an adaptive approach. So, and if we unpack MSD, it's really about trying to achieve sustained change, so results that last, and also large-scale impact to reach many poor. So MSD is one way of doing that, and it could help us strengthening what we're already doing, I think. MSD, or a key in MSD rather, is the systems analysis, and to have a very holistic approach and a pro-poor view on the development problem. So to look at the whole system, to understand which aspects of the system that are not working for the poor, why it's not inclusive of the poor. So in this case, the education system or the labor market system or a skills development system. And with MSD, we try really to move from these visible symptoms to more underlying root causes, which is really about, could be behaviors or business models, work practices, regulations, enabling conditions. So put it another way, it means that we're like looking beyond the visible tip of the iceberg to really understand what is under the surface and to address the problems under there beneath, because that's where we will have really impact. And as a consequence, a systemic approach, in this case MSD, also aims to address system level constraints. So which means then that we will reach hopefully many people in the target group. And I think another important part of MSD is the facilitation mechanism to create incentives and build capacity of local actors, both public and of course private, and in the system, so that they can bring about the change themselves. So it's a lot about facilitating change and have a catalytic role rather than providing the solution. And I think finally, MSD is, as I mentioned earlier, it's an experimental and adaptive approach where we test new ways of doing things, new solutions, and we can revisit the intervention design, we can modify and adjust and scale up when things are working or reject if they're not working. And of course, it includes working with a lot of different actors, including the private sector, which are key actors in these systems. So I think in a nutshell, MSD is an adaptive and systemic approach that could help us reach many poor and achieve the results that last and that we want.
Right. So it's quite
Mm.
flexible. And, as you touch on the poor, I'm wanting to know from, how effective MSD has been so far in perhaps contributing to a reduction in poverty levels.
Well, so I think MSD is like a result of an evolution, in doing, especially, I mean, it comes from market development and employment and private sector development. So it's an evolution of how we can do that better and achieve results. So it has a very pro-poor approach, where we put the poor person or individual at the very center and ask ourselves, so why is it not inclusive? Why is the market or the system not inclusive of them? And how could we facilitate so that they become economic actors in that space and benefit from that? In that way, I think it has really made, especially I think these types of projects and programs in private, including, you can include, there are a lot of skills development interventions in those types of projects and programs, and to really have a pro-poor view. But I think with MSD, you don't necessarily, even if you have the poor at the center, you don't necessarily target the poor with your intervention, but rather you work with the actors in the system to create incentives so that they can provide different solutions that include the poor. So in that way, it's a very, it's now regarded as, I would say, best practice especially in private sector development, income generation projects, and so on.
And you did touch on skills, which does bring me to my next question. How do you think the MSD approach can be best applied to the education sector for the development of skills?
Well, first of all, I just want to highlight that we do all development projects with our partners. So, it's actually our partners like UNIDO that help us realizing our development objectives. So, for example, this partnership with UNIDO in the LKDF, the Learning and Knowledge Development Facility, where we also try to apply this approach. So we have all these development challenges, and looking ahead, factors like that has already been mentioned in this forum, like automation and digitalization, climate change, and it will change the labor market and people's prospect for incomes and jobs. And countries will go through these different transitions, and we already have huge unemployment among youth, and we have like 2 billion people worldwide in the informal economy, and skills development is identified as one key area to address this. So, but I think we have to ensure that people possess the necessary skill, and we have to take into account all these enormous challenges. But to do this, we have to be innovative. We have to think beyond the usual. We have to collaborate with all actors, and together we have to be, adaptive to a changing world. We have to work catalytically. We want to have a systemic impact. So MSD could give us, is one roadmap on how to go about all that. And of course, if you want to be more specific, how could we use MSD in skills development? I think it's still on explorative phase of applying MSD in specifically education and skills, but it's certainly very relevant there. We have the skills gap, and we think that a systemic approach like MSD could create more flexible and holistic education systems, where we can create innovative, demand-driven skills opportunities. And for example, I think if you apply the MSD lens, we would probably think that, or if you apply the MSD lens in a skills development project, then the skills gap we would probably regard that as a symptom of a poorly functioning skills market, right? And to fill that gap would, in an MSD perspective, just address the symptom. we have to look at the underlying causes, that causes the gap. So the key question is really, why is there a skills gap? And if there is a market demand for certain skills, why are those skills not provided by the skills market? Why is the market not working? And there you have these incentives that we're talking about, the role of incentives among key actors, public and private, they must be considered in the design, and to understand the incentives, and not only looking at pure capacity constraints. So I think MSD could be a really good tool to understand both the wider context, but also, what is really the problem and how could we address that to have real impact. So I think programs, we have been more successful in doing more demand-driven programs. We're collaborating much more with private sector and local industry in skills development. But I think we also have to get better at integrating skills or skills projects in like larger systems, like education systems in a country. So our results, I think, would be more likely to be sustained and have more potentials to upscale if we manage to have more, a holistic approach like that. So I think MSD could probably help us to have that holistic view and to address these challenges on systems level rather than on like an individual level or project level. Because, for example, if you have an isolated training project, that could help build capacities to a limited number of people, but then there are like thousands of other people that need this training or need these skills, and one project can't deliver this to all of them. So MSD could maybe help us to identify, what is the real issue? Is it lack of training, or is it rather that actors in this context have very little incentives to provide this, and what can we do about that? So more to, instead of deliver maybe different solutions, we could facilitate new models. So we can facilitate so that the actors really provide new models or partnerships or services. So yeah.
No, I agree 100%. And I'm wondering if some of the questions that you have raised, I'm wondering if Sida has asked in terms of trying to address the green skills gap, and to what degree you feel the MSD approach can help the development of green skills.
That's a very good question. I must say that I think there is, it's something we could explore further. Let me put it that way. I think we're working with MSD a lot in economic development programs in general, and skills is very often a part of that. But and also the green aspects and environment and climate change is always like something we integrate. We have we always, as all Sida programs, or all the programs that we fund, have to integrate that perspective of environment and climate change. But when it comes specifically to green skills, I think we could probably explore that further and see how we can do that. Though I think that MSD it's as I try to explain here, it is a very good approach when you want to try new things, when you want to be innovative and you want to to start from the beginning, how this is a problem. So how could we actually go about this, and how could we do this together? How could we find the best solution for this? So in that sense, I think MSD could be a very good tool to explore that.
I'm just concerned, if I'm honest, curious about the implications then of, what it does appear to be a trial and error approach to solving some solutions. What are the complications, if there are any?
Well, I think I must, if I challenge that thought and I say, if we do it the more traditional way, where we decide from the beginning what we're supposed to do and then we just do it, and for example, as donors, we we just follow up on, yeah, okay, these activities that we decided on, they're implemented and they're done, and it seems to you achieve fairly good results. But if there is no mechanism to revisit your design and to really see if you will have real impact in the long term, for example, or if you're not able, if your approach or the method that you're using is not helping you to adapt to changing realities, or you realize that actually we shouldn't have worked with this partner, we should have worked with that partner or this actor, or we should have tried that solution instead, and you can't change that, I would say that is a very high cost. So I think I see what you mean. I think MSD is not costly in terms of money, but it takes time. So you need, I think all these types of approaches, they need time. You would see results. You would have to be more patient for the results, I think. So in that sense, yes, it's more costly if you consider time as one of these costs.
I accept your points. And I think the argument that you are making, in the sense that the opportunity cost of not trying out a different, more flexible, adaptive approach could be a lot greater in the long run. Which brings me to my next question regarding how widely used and accepted has the MSD approach been with the countries and the institutions that Sida currently partners with?
Well, in development cooperation, it's a widely accepted approach. But I think I would say also among implementing partners in this field, in market development, private sector development, including skills development, I think it's a widely it's an established and prioritized approach. As I said, it's regarded as best practice. And I think when we talk to private sector actors, they are all, I would say, most of the time they are very much on board with this approach. And if you unpack it, sort of what it includes and what it means, it's very much in line with also how the private sector works in many ways. So it's very compatible with that. When it comes to governments and public institutions, I agree, it is more of a challenge, since I said it's an approach that is more indirect. It's about facilitating, being catalytical, and maybe it's more difficult to see what is systemic change. How do we know when we have achieved that? And it could be more difficult to maybe for them to understand why that would be better than maybe a more direct approach, where we pay for training or we deliver solutions, and they can see the results or the outputs more upfront. So I think that is something we still have to, we have to communicate much better to hosting countries where we do development cooperation, the benefits of these types of approaches.
Elisabet, thank you so much for making us wise on the subject of MSD, and that wrapping our first power talk, and providing a great way and a great manner for us to usher in the next power talk, which will be looking at investments, of course, for green TVET. The objective of this talk specifically is to learn about financial solutions in Africa for TVET, to learn about the skills, needs, and demands in a specific country setting, also the opportunities to develop green skills. And I do have my next two speakers already ready to tackle in on the subject. Cleophas Takaiza from TEVETA, and also Jonathan Lemisa from Hitachi Construction, Zambia. Gentlemen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Fifi.
Lovely, lovely. Mr. Takaiza, let me begin with you regarding what the needs and the demands for TVET in Zambia are specifically, and also what the financing solutions available are presently.
Thank you very much, Fifi. Maybe just to give a short background to this, in case you may not be very familiar with TVET in Zambia. I think we had some economic reforms in Zambia starting the early 90s, and this brought about a lot of economic liberalization. And before that, we saw TVET predominantly resting on government for every financing. But coming after early 90s, with the liberalization of the economy and also seeing that these training institutions that we had at the time were tilted towards training for the public sector, because most of the economy was public sector driven, parastatals. Now we saw a lot of private sector participation coming on board. So in 1996, government brought a new TVET policy, which encouraged private sector participation. So we saw a lot of private sector participation, a lot of TVET providers coming on board, which are private sector driven. And in terms of financing, we had a situation where most of the TVET was financed by government, like I said before. But because of this increased private sector participation since 1993, 94 to 96, we saw now these private sector providers coming on board, and we saw some of the financing coming from the private sector. Some now is training, these learners now needed to pay for themselves to access TVET training. But government still continued to provide some of the financing to TVET in terms of government grants. It gave operational grants to government institutions. It also gave bursaries to some of the learners who could not afford accessing TVET. But also there were some companies that opened up their own private TVET facility in company. And such were not very many, but they did that because some of them were not very happy with the quality of TVET that was coming from the public sector. So we also experienced a bit of contributions to TVET from the cooperating and development partners, but this would come in form of project financing. And all these were found not to be very sustainable. And the government then engaged all the stakeholders, and in 2016 passed a piece of legislation that introduced what we are calling the training levy. This training levy basically is a levy that is collected from companies that have a turnover of anything above 800,000 kwacha, which is somewhere around $40,000 to $50,000. This is money dedicated to improve TVET provision, but obviously it's not enough to cater for all the needs of the TVET sector. But we still do see some private companies now running and providing TVET. So proceeds from the skills development levy could be invested in improving infrastructure, for example, procuring training tools and equipment, and also systems development in terms of ensuring that curricula is updated, also maybe staff capacity building, and also supporting some of the learners that are not able to sponsor themselves to access TVET. But again, like before, it's not meeting all the needs. The gaps are still there. So private sector participation is still very active. And of late, we have seen a lot of PP, public-private partnership coming on board, just to make sure that we have a TVET that is of quality and is responding to the needs of the private sector.
Okay, Cleophas, let me stop you there for a second. Thank you so much for taking us through the evolution of TVET there in Zambia, and also, from how it began to what government has tried to do to strengthen the candidates that come out of there, and of course the private sector and the role of the private sector at that. And let's get in the private sector to also perhaps comment on that. Mr. Just your views on TVET, and also whether you think that the private sector needs currently, and the subsequent demand currently is being met in your view, or in Hitachi's view.
Thank you very much, Fifi, and very well laid out preamble by my colleague. And yes, definitely, when you look at the private sector, let me speak of Hitachi as an example. You might interest you to know that as a multinational company, we've set up base in Zambia, but primarily focusing at achieving certain goals, one of which is to satisfy our customers. But one of the major challenges that has come up in the past is one of the costs due to labor. And this is due to the fact that most companies, when they are set up, are oriented to bringing in expert staff to meet the customer requirements. But with the coming of various laws, like my colleague Elia mentioned, that legislation has been passed in various areas, one which tackles the labor market, you'll find that the government has prioritized nationalizing certain positions to be filled in by nationals. So what this means now for us is that we must fill in the gap that could have been filled in by expatriate labor. And being an engineering company like ourselves, which is dealing with the mining sector and heavy equipment repair industry, you'll find that obviously about maybe 50 to 60% of our workforce are technical in nature. And that means that our only source of such expertise could be through the TVET learning institutions. So for us, yes, the gap becomes a real gap that we require to make use of learners that have passed through the TVET institutions, but of course also meet the requirements of the industry as it might demand, as I've given an example of replacing experts with the locals. So with the coming of various models, and I'm happy to mention one particular model that has been mentioned already by Cleophas, of the PPDP model. We've seen the participation of private sector in the development of the TVET sector. A particular example that we're working with ourselves is the one that has been done currently at Northern Technical College, in which we've seen the modernization of the heavy equipment repair department, graduating and ensuring that the curriculum has been revised to meet what the feedback from the industry has been demanding. So it fits into our philosophy as private sector, because for us to meet the demands of our clients, then we must ensure that we continuously develop our local staff. And it could be a challenge, yes, internally to meet some of these requirements because of things like infrastructure, which we might not have as a private industry. However, through partnerships with authorities like TEVETA and other participating agencies, we've been able to create an environment where with their infrastructure, we can bring in capital investment, and through that develop certain learning facilities that meet the requirements, minimum requirements as per demand. So yes, there's a real demand. And of course, I think we continue to champion as private sector such engagements with public institutions and authorities like TEVETA. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Takaiza, responding to what was just shared, there is initiatives underway from the private sector to obviously try to strengthen the skill of the workforce through its own TVET programs. You did say that, of course, I mean, even though such initiatives are ongoing and there is funding, it's currently not enough. So I'm just interested in your view of what was just shared, and adding to that, the role that TVET can play in Zambia, specifically in the development of green skills.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, like my colleague has said, we are very grateful that I think industry as a key partner in all this has come on board just to ensure that we move together. Government still has very basic infrastructure, but it's the equipment that we are lacking. And also, most of the curricula that we were running has lagged too far behind. And we have embarked on reviewing curricula, obviously with the participation of our key partner who are industry. But if we talk about, for example, promoting green skilled, I am happy to share with you that it matters of climate change, environmental degradation, and scarcity of resources, I think are top on the agenda on many government fora. And in that regard, we have been challenged to ensure that we manage TVET in a manner that it is able to produce skilled personnel that is adaptable to the changing nature of work and also responding to those issues of the green worker and the green economy. So our approach as an authority, with the participation of our key stakeholders, we believe that green skills and attitudes should be part of the curricula, even as we are reviewing all the curricula or developing new curricula, as it were. And also, green skills must be inherent in all our training programs, meaning that we need to ensure that even our training institutions are sensitized. We try as much as possible to have a green training institution, a green trainer in the sense of the lecturers themselves. We must reorient our teacher training syllabus to ensure that we instill aspects of green skills at that level. Only then will we see green skills being achieved, and we believe and we are convinced that a green economy or green industry or society can only be achieved when green skills, green attitudes, and knowledge become part of our work and life throughout the process. And this is something that we are happy because even industry, as we discuss these things, are sharing this vision. So what we are doing now is that for each and every curricula that we subject to a revision, we make sure that issues of promoting a green TVET are top on the agenda. Okay. So I think that's the approach we are taking.
Okay, a quick question for you, Cleophas, coming from the audience. It's pertaining to your brief on TEVETA. There's an interest in any challenges that you have experienced so far. And I think I'd like to add to that and ask, how have you dealt with those challenges?
Okay, like we said, most of the challenges that we face normally came as a result of inadequate funding to the sector. Maybe if I can start with very basic things. TEVET as a sector, I think didn't receive enough attention, at least from my part of the world. Even the youngsters, if you encourage them to take up a TVET program, what comes to their mind when they leave primary school or secondary school, they want to go to a university so that they get a white-collar job. So to encourage such a one to go to a college to get a TVET, to pursue a TVET course is a challenge. It has been a challenge and it is still a challenge. So in that regard, what we are attempting to do now is to try and rebrand our TVET system and talk TVET in terms of a job that it can give to a learner and how it can improve their livelihood. Jobs in Zambia, as we speak today, are very rare. There are a lot of university graduates out there with very good degrees, but they can't get employed. But with a TVET qualification, it's a little easier to get something to do and earn a living. So it's one of the challenges. But also I did mention to say that I think our TVET system, because we depended so much on government financing, and because of the challenges that government was facing funding to TVET continued to deteriorate, and there was a tendency of allocating more resources to either general education or other higher education, and TVET would get the minimal portion. So it affected even the quality, the status, including the investments that went into this. So with the coming on board of the Skills Development Fund, because this fund is dedicated for TVET, I know that there might be other thoughts to come in future, but we believe that this is going to be reserved for TVET. And because private sector is the one which is contributing to this fund, unlike before where we had really to plead with the private sector to join hands with us, now they have reason to come to the table because they are putting their money on the table. So together now that we are close with private sector, we are seeing ourselves at least having a partner who is going to help us champion the skills agenda. So the issue of bridging the gap between industry and training provider is narrowing slowly because of this carrot. I don't know whether I should call it a carrot or an incentive, because of this money that they themselves are putting on the table. And we have said you must have a say over how this money is going to be utilized. It is narrowing the gap and it's making our work a little easier. But talking about one of the serious challenges that we are facing even as we speak today, I think the outbreak of this pandemic, COVID, has really hit us very hard, because from early this year, as early as March, most of our TVET providers in Zambia participate very little on the digital platform. We rely on face-to-face kind of teaching and learning. And when TVET, this COVID-19 was pronounced, at least in my country, and the government decided to close down schools to slow down the spread of COVID, we saw a situation where the whole sector was paralyzed, nothing was happening, and our institutions could not communicate with the learners. And after all, most of our trainers do not have the skill and capacity to interact and teach using the digital platform. This is a challenge that we think we must deal with. We have started. I don't know how long it's going to take us, but we must just do it because we don't know what other pandemic will come. Meanwhile, skills development must continue. I would like to learn from other systems.
This is true, and I think it's a challenge, of course, that Zambia is not experiencing alone. Many developing nations experiencing that challenge. And I would like to also add to your comment regarding the rebranding of the TVET systems there. I wonder if in the private sector playing a role to make such occupations a lot more attractive to the jobs. We need a change in market dynamics on how these jobs are valued, how they are remunerated. I speak specifically in saying that, for instance, I know there's a lot less shame of being a plumber in the UK or a carpenter because you are adequately compensated, whereas the same cannot be said for Africa. And why perhaps there's this constant pursuit of these white collar jobs and these university degrees. But Jonathan, just to bring you back into the conversation, I don't want you to feel ignored, and bringing the focus back to green skills, of course. Speak to me about the demand for green skills in your sector specifically. What is being done to attract these skills and harness them?
Thank you, Fifi. Yes, as you might be aware, we are an equipment, original equipment manufacturer ourselves as Hitachi. And if you trace the roots of Hitachi, we trace it back to the founding company, which is Japanese itself. And Japan as a nation is part of the group of countries that are compliant to the number of green regulations that have been adopted globally. So that then tells that as we also promote our business of providing heavy equipment, mobile equipment, our equipment must meet the requirements for green regulations. I'll give an example of engines, for instance, the evolution in engines. We've seen that due to green regulations, there's a requirement that our engines meet the requirements in terms of the emissions, for instance, carbon emissions. So through that, most of the equipment that we'll be bringing into our country to sell through to our customers will come with modern engines that should meet the emission regulations that is there. That in itself creates a gap for our staff, because then they must be brought or made aware of the changes that come with such developments in technology. So as technology evolves, we've seen that internally we've had to make possible to platforms where we provide more information about green skills required to sustain the operations of our equipment, because now they are compliant with the green regulations that have been brought forward. Most importantly, like I said before, also through external partnerships and with the coming of the PPTP model, we've seen that also the TVET sector is working towards also meeting up the gap. So the importance is quite significant. The demand is quite huge for green skills. Of course, like Cleophas mentioned, they must have, they currently have a number of challenges, yes, because of funding and the like. But at least we can see that there's a commitment to narrow this gap in the near future. And through our partnerships with the private sector and public and private sector, I think going forward, maybe in the next couple of years, we could even narrow this gap further, but the demand is quite huge. Like I mentioned, if we employ a number of experts who are coming from already developed nations, for instance, we employ a technician from Australia, these people might have come with those skills already because they're coming from developed countries. However, the moment we decide to Zambianize or nationalize these positions and empower our locals, then it means we also have to step in and provide necessary skill and knowledge to back up and support our customers with the latest technology that is coming. So really, yeah, the is huge. The demand is quite high, and it means that all stakeholders must come forward and see how best we can mitigate this gap. Because that's, again, if you talk of branding and marketing, that's the challenge now. How do we market and brand our locals so that they can meet the expectation of our customers? Because that has been the cry. If you bring in the locals, probably they'll be lacking this skill because of the position where we are as a nation. However, this should not deter us. Like I said, for instance, ourselves as Hitachi, we've committed through a number of partnerships with local institutions to see how best we can support this. Currently, we are in talks with TEVETA themselves about possible skills development platforms where we are collaborating to ensuring that the funding challenge could be mitigated through the Skills Development Fund, through MOUs aimed at us providing the equipment that they need for teaching, for instance, support them with that kind of infrastructure. This should help in the short to medium term, but of course, with the expectation that in the long term, the gap could be narrowed. But yes, definitely the demand is quite high.
And so by optimistic you are perhaps on reducing that gap in the medium term. The fact that there is quite a lot of commitment, and in fact we will be unpacking how to perhaps accelerate funding in the sector to narrow the gap a lot quicker. But gentlemen, I'm going to have to leave it there with you guys. Thank you so much. Topic that we will be discussing right now is the water sector as a jobs. As you can see, me and the speaker that we'll be having this conversation with have been talking already about this, and I'm really interested to hear more and to have her share more thinks about the subject matter. So we'll learn about the importance of water, of course, as a panacea for jobs and a greener economy. We'll also learn about the USAID interventions in Morocco, and also identify ways to further support the sector with Salma Kadiri, who is representing the USAID Morocco. Salma, afternoon.
Good afternoon, Fifi. Thank you for having me for this session.
Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to it because, of course, our previous speaker before we went to a lunch, Nadir, was talking to us about, how important water was, and also dropped a few stats for us to say that, the amount of water that we have has not kept up with the rate of population growth, and that this is a formula that is not sustainable. So I'd like your view on this as we really attempt to understand the world of water a lot better and the key role that water can play in the world of work.
Thank you, Fifi. Yeah, first, I'm happy to be here to share the perspective and the experience of USAID in this field. So as you know, we're living right now a global crisis on the water, which increase disease, undermine the economic growth, foster insecurity, and generally reduce the capacity of countries to accelerate their journey to self-reliance. So let me first allow me to share with you a few important figures that will help understand how the problem is huge all over the world. So around the world, 3 out of 10 people lack access of safe drinking in their homes. 3 billion lacks basic access for hand washing facilities. 6 out of 10 people lacks access to sanitations. And most importantly, around 300,000 children die every day. Children under the age of 5 years old die every year from diarrhea, which is one of the consequences of unsafe drinking water and sanitations and hand hygiene. So in addition to these challenges, often the lack of water is increasing, and the increasing competition among users, industries, agriculture, and the population often exacerbate the tension and can lead to communities or nations conflicts and loss of resilience. So to address these challenges, USAID, in collaboration with 17 US agencies, we adopted the Global Water Strategy in 2017. And through this strategy and global vision, we're trying to achieve 4 major objectives that are strategic and also interlinked. First, we try to promote sustainable access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and also adoption of change in hygiene behaviors for the population all over the world. We're also encouraging access to sound management and protection of fresh water resources, which are essential for the living. And also we try to reduce conflicts through promoting cooperation and shared waters among different populations. And finally, we try to strengthen water sector governance, the financing, and also the workforce in the water sector. So in support to this global strategy, USAID is seeking to help 15 million people all over the world by the end of year 2022 to access sustainable, safe drinking water. And also we're targeting 8 million people with sustainable access to sanitations. So in fact, challenges related to the water, access to water and hygiene in general are huge all over the world, and building capacities and green skills locally is essential to developing countries and to helping them address the growing demand on water, to mitigate the climate change impacts such as drought, floods, and also pollution and other component environmental factors.
Thank you so much for educating and enlightening those statistics that you did begin with. I mean, horrible statistics. We certainly want a significant reduction in them. And you are right, and I think you've painted the picture quite clearly. the water challenge is a big problem. What is quite big also is the target that USAID has set itself to ensure more people have got access to sustainable access rather to water. I'm curious, how far are you from meeting that target, and what do you think the major obstacles could be to meeting that target of getting, is it 15 million people access to sustainable water by the year 2022?
Actually, we don't have, like, for now, it's a new strategy that issued in 2017, and we're planning to do a sort of impact study or evaluation of results at the end of 2020. But I can share with you some results that are dated and related to the year 2017. Allow me a few minutes, and I'll be happy to share them with you.
All right. So while you can ask, Salma, while you get that, let's actually continue and keep the conversation going. I didn't realize you were so new, but nonetheless, it's quite a big one, and I set yourselves up to something that you didn't think was achievable. But in the meantime, let's really discuss about skills development, and it's about green skills development. So how is the USAID driving skills development in Morocco, as well as job creation in Morocco's water sector?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I will just quickly address the first your previous question, because up to the year 2000, between the year 2008 and 2017, USAID was able to help 42 million people to receive sustainable access to the water supply, and we also helped 27 million people received access to sanitation. So this was during the 10 years. So it was evaluation of the previous strategy. So we're still ambitious for this new strategy, and once we progress in its implementation, for sure USAID will be happy to share the results. So, and as for your question regarding what we're trying to do to drive green skills here in Morocco, actually we're helping Morocco among other countries to accelerate the journey to self-reliance. And here, with regard to the water sector, we try to help the government to develop an inclusive and integrated water resource management strategy. This is a holistic approach recognized internationally as a way to equitably and sustainably manage the diminishing water resources. So the skills related to this approach are commonly known as belonging to the green skills that are essential for the transition towards the green economy. So, and in order actually to ensure that more countries are environmental friendly and more societies are adopting this culture, we need to spread or to help green skills over the sectors, cross sectors, and also over different level of the workforce. So in Morocco, greening across industries that are engaged in the water, it's definitely required from us to help the existing workforce to upskill their competencies, but also train the new generation that will come to the market and equip them with competencies that are environmentally friendly, and also, of course, respond to the labor market demand. So what we've done in Morocco is that we supported a flagship program called H2O Maghreb project that is born out of a private and public partnership with the two private sector partners, Ion Reality and Festo, and also we have a partner, implemented partner, which is Unido, and we work alongside also with the government partner, which are also essential, the Office of National Electricity and Drinking Water, ONE, and two ministries, the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Equipment. So the model we developed under this entrepreneurship is quite interesting, as it showed the role of the private sector in bringing innovation and the latest technology and use in science to upgrade the level of learning for existing workforce or for new students. We use for these technologies virtual reality, which I will explain later. So this model helped come up with modular approach to train students with modernized curricula and fitting to the need of labor market. So up to date, we developed 19 training models on the sector, on the water and wastewater sector, to address water, wastewater, and also operation and the maintenance, especially for plants on treatment, water and wastewater treatment. So all these models include also, which is important, contents that raise awareness of the students and professionals on climate change issues. And we also still developing 4 additional models that will address challenges related to protecting environment, such as desalination, rain and water management. Also, we're working on optimization of the energy of wastewater, and also how to better treat the wastewater from industries, which are causing a lot of issues to the environment. So another strength of this approach is that it's very flexible. It can be adapted to other contexts and other countries' needs, for example, because we think that H2O Maghreb, it's a pilot phase here in Morocco, but we think what we developed here can be useful to other countries, so they can use the knowledge that we developed together and adapt it to their need, either in the MENA region or in other sub-Saharan countries.
And to those countries that might be interested, in extending or in importing, as it were, that approach. I mean, how effective have your interventions thus far been in improving water productivity and perhaps water management? If we just finish off there.
Yeah. So one of the impacts here, actually, this program will have short-term impact and long-term impact. Let's start with short-term impact. It's the education of the new professionals who will be very effective and applying these principles of the integrated water resource management in Morocco, in their professional work, either in private sector or in public entities. So we will be gaining in terms of efficiency and also in expertise in the field. So it will help improve the productivity of water operators in Morocco. This is on the short term. Up to now, the H2O Maghreb trained 3 cohorts of trainees, and surprisingly, the majority of these trainees were women, and they were at the top of their classes. So it's really interesting that we're also helping helping young women to be empowered and access to male-dominated sectors. This is also one of the results that we're proud of and we're working on, a short-term result and maybe long-term. One of the long-term objectives that we're thinking of is to try to disseminate these principles across stakeholders of the sector, and also the education system, so they can adopt this approach and help spread it in other institutions or education institutions, and especially the vocational training sector. So we also think that through this program, we will help disseminate the culture of green skills and better use of the water management all over Morocco and maybe in other countries that are interested to adopt this model.
Salma, thank you so much. I believe that lockdown restrictions are enabling for me to revisit Morocco again. I was there about 2 years ago and it was fantastic. And I know how that country has been focused on ramping up its oceans economy. Let us move on now to cover the EU Green Deal diplomacy. It's an important deal, of course, for diplomacy. And in this next, we will be unpacking exactly what this EU Green Deal is. We are looking and trying to understand climate diplomacy and how the EU does work in developing countries, more importantly. And also we'll ask whether the EU Green Deal can become an instrument to skills development. And joining me for that conversation, you can see her, she's bright and ready, Shada Islam from New Horizons Project. Shada, thanks so much for your time. In a nutshell, what is the EU Green Deal?
Hi, Fifi. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to interact with you, Fifi. So look, this is a very transformational project. It's a visionary project, but also has very practical implications. Now, we've heard across the world how the pandemic has caused a slowdown, a massive slowdown in our economies and increased the number of people without jobs. And although this Green Deal was sort of invented, if you like, before the pandemic, it, I think, now has even more resonance because as you're talking to your other guests, the focus on green jobs, green growth, I think could be a stimulus, a badly needed stimulus for the recovery, the sustained recovery we all want, the green recovery we all want. So what is it? So basically what the European Commission is trying to do and trying to convince its member states, the 27 member states to do, is to actually adhere and align EU policy with three massive international commitments that it's made. So first of all, you know that the EU has raised its ambitions as regards the reduction of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So it used to be 40% by 2030, now it's 55% by 2030. So that's quite a big step forward. The other ambition is to have climate neutrality by 2050, to become the first continent to have climate neutrality by 2050. And the third one obviously is linked to the Paris Agreement and all the obligations that come with it. Now, what does it entail? A number of different kinds of actions, but let me just give you a few. Obviously, the focus is very much on investment in new technology, clean technology. So that's going to be a huge part of the effort. Investment in innovation, the creation of a research area across the 27 countries. So working together on new areas of research, sort of working together rather than, sort of like helping each other. Clean transport, obviously electric cars, electric buses and metros, etc. Clean agriculture, smart climate attuned, aligned agriculture. Decarbonizing the energy sector, so a lot of focus on clean hydrogen rather than fossil fuels, or obviously also renewable energies. And lastly, energy efficient buildings. So, we live in a cold climate. It's getting rather frosty here already. So a lot of our buildings, have warming and heating systems, and these need to be made more efficient. So a lot of action and money. So there's money in it as well. The EU has agreed that it will have a recovery fund, a new budget for 7 years, and a big chunk of will be spent on Green Deal projects. Now, Fifi, just to say, it hasn't been easy because, it sounds very good on paper. And of course, as I said, it's very visionary. But as you know, we are 27 countries with very different energy sectors, very different energy priorities. And getting everyone together on this is still quite a challenge. A number of our countries have coal-fired, a number of our countries have natural gas, some are oil producing still. So to get everyone together is going to be a bit of a challenge. So the debate has started, the money is there, and all the resources, if you like, the human resources, the political resources, the financial resources, all of them are being mobilized to try and get this Green Deal done. It's still a challenge, but the decision has been taken at the highest level. And so we're looking forward to Europe becoming a cleaner place, a greener place.
Cleaner, greener, I think they're synonymous, no? And I suppose that the whole world is looking forward to that and looking forward to its own environment, also achieving those targets. But just honing in on the framework of the EU Green Deal, do you see any opportunities, given that it's still in its nascent stage, but do you see any opportunities for this Green Deal to enhance climate change diplomacy, particularly in developing nations, which I'm speaking to you from today?
Yeah, and I was born in Asia, brought up in Europe, so I know the two, let's say, continents and the two concerns and priorities. So thank you, Fifi. So the thing is, so fine, Europe can have its Green Deal, but we live in a globalized, interdependent, interconnected world. And what Europe doesn't stay in Europe. We import, we export, we're very much part of this global system. So there has to be a comparable move forward, comparable progress by countries across the world. Now, we've known and we see, unfortunately, that under the Trump administration, at least, there's been a retreat from some of the climate change obligations and commitments made by the United States. We've seen that China is stepping up and making some very ambitious commitments as well. So there is room for a European Union to take the lead. The European Union, as you know, Fifi, if you're based in Africa, has strong partnerships across the world. It has a deep network of partnerships. It also has diplomats across the world, who can be mobilized now to become what we call climate diplomats. Now, this is something that I'm very excited about because, we can't do it alone. And the world is watching Europe, as you said, with interest, but I have to confess, interest, curiosity, but also trepidation, some concerns, because some of the messaging from the European Union, I'm a think tanker and I'm an independent expert. And I watched this, some of the messages that are coming out from the European Union, just because we haven't made up our minds yet, there is, as I said, tension within the EU. Some of the messages are causing concern across the world. One of them, obviously, is this idea, and I think, it will happen, but how will it happen, is this carbon border adjustment tax. Now, the idea behind it is pretty simple. If the EU goes green and it's invested all this money in green energy, then, prices will go up for its exports, for its economy, for consumer products. So if other countries haven't made the same steps, they will have a competitive and unfair competitive edge. So when they export to the EU, they'll be subject to a tax, which will bring them on a par with European products. Sounds simple. But is that consistent with the rules of the World Trade Organization? How will the EU ensure that other countries do move up the ladder, if you like? So will there be aid programs, assistance programs? The European Union says yes. This carbon border tax adjustment has created a lot of, let's say, fear in many exporting countries. And I think the EU has to work very hard to try and allay those fears by being more transparent and keeping countries involved, engaged, consulting them as they move up this conversation. Mm-hmm. Do I have time to tell you another area where we need to be a bit careful when we talk about it?
You know what, you're actually preempting a question that has actually come through from the audience about, being careful and also your concerns, because there's an audience member that is asking about the concern of the green integration with regards of energy with North Africa and EU interconnection. So perhaps to the other point that you wanted to share pertaining other potential concerns.
Yes, so as I said, we'll have to be very careful. We're in uncharted territory. We're in a very new world. And we are the leaders as Europeans. And we have the know-how, or we're at least acquiring the know-how. We have the funds to acquire the know-how. So we need to be able to share it in an equitable manner with countries that are our neighbors, but also beyond. And we need to make sure that what we're doing doesn't turn into protectionism. At the moment in the world, there are just too many economic nationalist agendas. I won't name them. We know who we're talking about. But So the European Union is a believer in multilateralism with its neighbors, with partners. And I think that's going to be very important that we do not become is already a geopolitical argument, if you like, with East Asia, because the EU is taking quite a strong stance on imports of palm oil, which it alleges. Southeast Asian countries say that allegation is not true, but the EU, some people in the EU make the allegation that that is destroying forests. Palm oil plantations are destroying forests, leading to deforestation. So there are going to be possibly restrictions on imports. Now that has a scientific manner, because if we do not have rigorous scientific evidence-based actions, we can mislead the world and we can have actions that are not really compatible with living in a multilateral world. And the same thing, I think that's what your questioner is worried about, is when it comes to free trade agreements. So as you know, Fifi, the EU is very actively engaged in negotiating agreements, trade agreements with developing countries. These are very important in terms of boosting economic growth and driving recovery. There again, we have obligations. Any country engaging with the EU on this has an obligation to comply with very high environmental standards. Now that's fine, it's hunky-dory. How are they going to do that? Will we just have, sanctions for those who don't do it, or will we help? So my plea to the EU policymakers, and I make it everywhere I go, is to actually be very, very cooperative in any kind of green deal that goes
Shada,
global.
can I just take you through to the last of the questions that I think will be asked in this round as we do wrap up this very, and it seems quite a lot of interest in it. The potential of this deal to help developing countries in the reskilling and upskilling agenda, ultimately, for also the creation of new jobs. In your view, where do you think that stands?
For the moment, as one of your earlier guests said, I think this is a work in progress. And that's why I think there's a lot of room, Fifi, for partner countries in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, to draw up their agendas. Now, if we're talking Africa per se, I think what's really interesting is we're in the process of negotiating a new partnership with African countries. There was supposed to be a summit at the end of October. That's been delayed. That gives us actually more time to work out is about skills and jobs. Now, European Union is very focused on growth and jobs in Africa, because there's a sentiment here that if there is local development, a number of young people who take these very risky journeys as irregular migrants to come to Africa, they'll be less tempted to do so, and that they can stay back in Africa and travel in a regular manner, and also stay back in Africa and work for African growth and development. So if the African Union and if individual African countries come up with serious projects that have to do with green skills and jobs, green skills, talent development, if you like, in Africa, there will be a lot of attention that will be paid to that. Now, one of your guests earlier talked about teacher training programs, school curricula. I think what's going to be very important also, in addition, is also training for women, because as we know, throughout Africa and throughout developing countries, women entrepreneurs, women-led startups are very, very important. So, training women will be very essential. And then, as I said, creating jobs in partnership with local authorities, so not just with the national government, and also working hand in hand with businesses, business sector, public-private partnerships, if you like, in developing countries. So there's a lot of potential for working together, partnerships for climate, if you like, climate change, but this has to be a joint project. So I think that's going to be very important, even in this new EU-Africa relationship. Let's not just wait for Europe to come with its aid and assistance. So much talent, so much local talent in Africa, and so much money, actually, if you look closely in the business community in Africa.
The objectives and the current momentum that we are seeing towards combating climate change and trying to skill and reskill for a sustainable future, In your view, does that momentum change depending on what the outcome is come the 3rd of November? Would you rather not?
No, I can. No, I think on this one, I'm fairly confident that the EU's leadership on climate is not dependent on what happens in the elections. A number of other things that are happening in Europe, including the state of the EU-US relationship, or what happens on the broader geopolitical stage, if you like. But the climate leadership initiative that the European Union has taken on is very much indigenous, very much homegrown, and very much, Fifi, driven by European public opinion. I mean, you've all heard of Greta Thunberg. She's not the only one. If our politicians want to stay in power, which they all do, right, they have to understand and respond to public desires and aspirations. And climate is very high up on the public popular agenda here. Every school child in Europe knows about climate change and is convincing her parents to vote for green parties. You've seen the rise in popularity of green parties across the EU, and that's driven by this climate agenda. So it's a very political. So well, Shada, no, we're going to do this regardless of what happens on the 3rd of November.
Very, very encouraging to hear, and thank you for answering that question. It was Shada Islam who was speaking to us from New Horizons Project, of course, really unpacking and drilling into the meat of the Green Deal, the EU Green Deal diplomacy. What a power hour session we are having thus far, but we have come into the last leg of it, and it has been a talking point that has come out throughout the discussions today as well as yesterday, and it is the issue of money and the issue of financing, and this is exactly what we are going to be unpacking right now, looking strictly at green bonds versus social impact bonds. So the purpose and the objective of this session is to learn about the impact bonds and green-driven investment opportunity. We'll also understand their impact on delivering education and technical training in developing countries, as well as look at how we can open up for new funding solutions to invest in green skills. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Let me introduce you, however, to the audience. Up on your screen is Richard Johnson. He is the Chair of Development and Social Impact Bonds, and also Zachary Levey, who is speaking to us from Levoca. Zachary, you'll correct me there if I have mispronounced it, but let's get straight on to the discussion. Good afternoon, first of all.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Stunning. Richard, I'd like to begin with you. How social impact bonds work? What is your experience in understanding how they deliver on some of their intended targets, specifically when it comes to educational needs?
Thank you, Fifi. I'll start off then by trying to describe the way a social impact bond or an impact bond actually operates. Let's imagine I am a government and I have a problem with youth unemployment. I want to fix this, but I find that simply paying for training is not enough. I keep training young people and they don't get jobs. So I decide that I want to pay for outcomes. Instead of paying for input, paying for the training itself, I want to pay if and only if a young person achieves employment and stays in that employment. So I go to the service provider market and I say to the providers, look, this is what I'm willing to pay. I'm willing to pay $1,000 every time a young person finds a job, and I'm willing to pay another $2,000 if they're still in this job 6 months later. The service providers are interested in this. They believe in their training. They have good connections with employers. It's demand-led, strong vocational training. They believe in its potential to create employment. But where are they going to get the cash from to run this program? I'm only going to pay them when they achieve the outcome. Where are they going to get the working capital from that will pay for their teachers, pay for their training facilities, that will cover their costs until those outcomes start to be achieved? This is where social investors come in. An investor who is looking to invest in something which will deliver some sort of social impact. They want a return on that investment, and they want that return both to be financial and an increase in some sort of positive social outcome, social impact. The social investors come forward and they say, okay, we will pay for the service provider's costs up front. We will cover all of the running costs. And then when the outcomes start to be achieved, we will be repaid from those outcome payments. This is their investment, so they need to protect it. So they will very closely manage that program to make sure it's delivering. They'll put in place some very close data management systems. They'll put in place a very robust performance management system. And they'll have that service provider reporting to them on a weekly basis on how many they're enrolling, how many they're training, how many jobs that they're finding, how many employers they're talking to. When the program achieves the outcomes, then the investors are repaid. That essentially is a social impact bond. It's called a social impact bond generally when a government pays for the outcomes. It's called a development impact bond when some sort of development institution, a donor, the World Bank, some other financer, funder, pays for the outcome, for the impact. Social impact bond, development impact bonds confuse people as titles. Essentially, they're outcomes contracts using social investment to cover the running cost. There have been lots of these in the UK, in America, in Australia, some in Europe, a small number, relatively small number, a couple of dozen or so in developing economies, and a small number of those related to employment and skills. I chair one in Palestine, which I'll tell you about because it's a good example. So in Palestine, the World Bank are the outcome funder. They pay for the outcomes. They pay when a young person gets a job and keeps the job. They pay this through the Palestinian Authority. We have 4 investors: Palestinian Investment Fund, Local Sovereign Investment Fund, the Chilean Invest Palestine Fund, the Dutch FMO, and the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. The 4 of them together have put in the capital to make the program run. And over the next 3 years, we'll use maybe a dozen different service providers to deliver various training, work experience, job matching, and in-work support. Mm-hmm. And our objective will be about 1,000 young people into jobs. We have a small team in Palestine who manage the performance of this and oversee it for us.
All right. Thank you. We'll get more information there, and thank you for explaining, social impact and development impact funds so simply. I think I actually have a chance of passing that module in my upcoming exams. Of course, Richard, it's not as simple. South Africa, and allow me to make my arguments, and I'll get Zach and you can also weigh in. Here in South Africa, of course, what we did see in recent times, Cape Town almost became the first city to run out of water, and we did see a successful implementation and launch to market of a fund, which received quite a lot of appetite. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lot of talk about COVID-19 bonds, perhaps be an avenue for many countries, African countries specifically, to perhaps fund their recovery from this. I have, for the past 2-3 years, worked with debt managers on the continent, and there's been a lot of talk about perhaps infrastructure bonds as a way to plug in the infrastructure gap here in the continent, amongst other social impact bonds. But there's been questions around, okay, so what are the yields that these bonds are going to return? What are the maturities that we're looking at here? It's ultimately about return. So we have seen an appetite to invest for the good, but as an investor, you're still looking at what the return is. That perhaps you can weigh in here, and your view on whether the world of social impact bonds is as simple, and also whether the returns are satisfactory to warrant more of them as we do try to combat the impacts of climate change.
Sure. Well, so I think when we talk about returns in the instruments, I think there's a couple of important points to take a step back on. So I think the first is, I think as Richard was saying, is social impact bonds in their simplest form are two things. It's results-based contract, and there's a need for working capital. Maybe because the service provider doesn't have unrestricted funding to cover the cost of services, maybe they don't want to take the risk. But you do have a long litany of examples of results-based contracts in the employment sector without the need for pre-financing. Similarly, in the green sector, you do have a number of examples, actually leadership, of using results-based contracts without the need for pre-finance. Those include carbon credits, biodiversity offsets, energy efficiency, payments for environmental services. And so when we think about impact bonds, they're a specific type of financing for a specific type of activity. And you can use them for other things. When we talk about returns, there is a spectrum of capital and motivation. And certain types of actors are what some would call impact first. So they're really more keen to take on certain types of risk because they put a premium on those environmental or social impacts. There's other types of investors that would like to have environmental and social impacts, but the most important thing is the financial return. And you can create different structures within impact bonds that allow you to have both from the financial perspective, but there's also other instruments like green bonds, which I think are a lot of people know, which are simply regular fixed income instruments. They look and feel like a normal bond. They just simply have a green labeling to them and can be used to issue and finance big assets. But within that, there's also things that we're starting to look at, which is how do you create that fixed income look and feel, but also have certain performance incentives tied to it. And so there's no dry, is it the right return or not? If investors are willing to put up the money, the return's right. If you can't find money, you can't raise capital, then the return is wrong. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And I've got a feeling Richard's going to come in here a little bit more. Can I just ask, gentlemen, for you to kindly mute yourselves when you're not speaking? So that would be Zach on mute at this moment and coming to Richard now, just to talk about, pick up the point further. And also, so the thing is now in an African context, okay, within a market whereby liquidity does not match up to yours at this stage by any means. You've got a situation where some of our governments are heavily indebted. So you're talking about these bonds fit for purpose, but perhaps whereby you have a government that is playing the role of a guarantor here. I look at the yields and the cost of supporting these social and green bonds initiative for the governments is quite high, and I just wonder whether this framework is sustainable in a context where the debt on some of the balance sheets of governments specifically is already at unsustainable levels. But Richard, over to you.
Yeah, Fifi, there's an issue here with social impact bonds in that they're not bonds. The title is deeply misleading, I'm afraid. As Zach said, they are results-based contracts where somebody, a commissioner, a government, a funder, agrees to pay for a result, and investors come in and provide the working capital to achieve that result. The sort of return that they might be looking for varies on what the program is, who the funder is, who the investor is, and what their motivation is. But they might be looking for around a 10% return on this. That would be a reasonable sort of working assumption. It's not a green bond in the way that you've described it. In terms of the liquidity of the governments, so that sort of changes your question, I think, a little bit. For one of these results-based contracts to work, you have to have somebody who is willing and able to pay for the result, who's willing and able to pay for the outcome. You monetize the outcome. You monetize someone getting a job and sustaining that employment. Now, in a developing country context, you're either going to have to look elsewhere for that money, whether it's the World Bank or some other donor. There's something being created at the moment called an Education Outcomes Fund, which is aiming to provide some of this outcome payment in partnership with governments, or the government itself is going to have to buy into the notion that getting people into jobs might cost them something in the short term, but will deliver them something in the long term. Because we know that unemployment it's not just an economic driver, it's a driver of social inclusion and social well-being across a whole range of different measures.
Sure.
Trying to come up with some sort of formula where you actually recognize the income derived from that individual unemployment becomes very, very difficult as a short-term goal.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. And then I suppose coming to the theme of this power talk, then how then can these type of contracts help us to better fulfill the journey in which we're trying to pick up pace on, and that is developing green skills for a sustainable future? Zach?
Sure. So I think when we think about green skills, financing, and how to finance it, I think when we work in this area, we always start with what problem are we trying to solve with, and financing is simply a tool in which sometimes we can solve for a problem through that tool. But the core of it is really what's the challenge. And so I think when we look at developing countries, there's a number of important trends, and particularly on this topic. And so one of which I want to highlight is that very recently you've started to see banks report on climate-related risks. This, for us, signals a sea change in what may happen, probably more impactful than any climate accord or regulation, because banks are now starting to report on both the transition risks to a low carbon economy, so I guess leaving certain sectors that may be high carbon, but also starting to disclose physical risks of climate change. And those physical risks sometimes aren't labeled green and they aren't labeled climate, but they are indicative of a huge sea change in the demand for goods and services, from drought-resistant products, backup generation materials, construction services, analytics for climate risk, supply chain management, geospatial mapping, weather and catastrophe risk, agricultural technology and solution, and the list goes on and on. And so these will demand both new financing as well as new skills and new support for enterprises. So in addition to this, let's say, emerging market for climate risk, we also see opportunities, particularly in developing countries. Yes, renewable energy will continue to be an important part, but also when we look at many emerging market developing countries, you also have to look at both agro-ecosystem services in the agricultural sector, nature-based solutions, as well as in certain types of states, open assets. And all these are important parts of the economy. And so when we think about both the supply and demand for labor, there's, I think, a huge opportunity and I guess a pending need to think about how do you finance these types of projects and assets that will create the jobs, as well as make sure that on the supply side of labor, you have the skills to take advantage of that. And I think the interesting part of the environmental sector is because you're in the midst of a transitioning economy, you can almost think about financing the assets and building the skills together. And so we're looking and developing a number of different opportunities in which we are both targeting the financing of specific environmental assets, as well as incentivizing both the environmental performance as well as the social performance, or let's say green job creation, because you can do it hand in hand, and making sure those incentives are built into the financing to make sure that certain populations have access to those employment opportunities. And so I think as we think about this, it's important that the finance and the skills required to implement what's being financed start to talk to each other and can be integrated.
Okay, I actually want to talk to you about the opportunities then, if you can just, really unpack exactly what you are meaning here. But Richard, your thoughts on financing this green agenda, how best we can pursue it?
Okay, I'd make 2 points on this then, Fifi. First is in relation to skills. You talked about green skills. Look, we spend squillions of dollars across the world on training, and most of it is a complete waste of money. because the quality of the training is very poor and its link with employers, with labour markets, is very tenuous. If you want to have a good skills program, you need to think about paying for outcomes. You need to think about paying for results. You need to attach your money as a government, as a commissioner, as a contracting body, you need to attach your money to those results. And that's what you pay for. That's the first point around skills. Second point would be this, all of this, what I've talked about in terms of impact bonds, in terms of outcomes contracts, result-based contracts, you can also use to stimulate green activity with the same sort of principles in mind, right? So instead of paying for a solar-powered truck and buying someone a solar-powered truck, what you need to pay for is the number of kilowatt hours that that truck actually sells to the local village in terms of mobile phone recharging or whatever it is. So actually pay for the outcome of the activity, not the inputs into it. Don't think that you can create green solutions by prescribing the inputs. Decide what success looks like, attach your money to that success, and then let the investors and others come in and create solutions that will deliver on those results for you.
Richard, you just make everything sound so simple and seem so simple. And I'm coming back to you now, and I want to understand in terms of how developing nations specifically are using some of these channels in your view so far. What is your experience of how we are perhaps, or how we can perhaps take advantage of the social and development bonds a lot better to achieve some of the development goals we have for ourselves as a continent within the context of climate change?
Yeah, look, and I'll try and make this sound simple, but not oversimplify it really, Fifi, because I know this is complex. Of course, it's complex. This is going to be made harder for you by institutions like the World Bank, the Global Fund, Gates, you name it, they're going to make it harder for you because they don't pay for outcomes. They don't understand outcomes. They pay for inputs, and they encourage you to pay for inputs. They give you grants. They measure success in terms of disbursement of money, not in terms of the results that money achieves. If you actually want to make this work for you, you as the government have got to take it as a doctrine into your hearts that we're interested in results, in real impact here. We're not just interested in spending the money. Define what success looks like, define what performance looks like, and then work back from that. I don't think that someone in Washington or Joburg or London has got the answer. Let the answer be developed then locally, relevant to the context, relevant to the country, developed by the providers with support of maybe social investors and others, but you define that performance and that success, and that's where you attach your money to. Let the risk sit with the providers, for goodness sake. Stop taking the risk on yourselves because you're not getting anywhere that way.
Okay, agreed. Local solutions, local problems. Zach, if you can just drill in further to some of the investment and financing, specifically opportunities that you did allude to a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and so I think building off what Richard is saying, I think this idea and also some points you made a little bit earlier about does this make sense to do, and I think the framework really, when we think about the results-based contract, is how do you optimize the use of existing resources, particularly when you're looking at public sector or, let's say, multilateral institution resources. And so those resources, how do you make them be used better, potentially by paying based on results? Because the reality is, particularly in the TVET sector, is a lot of money spent and spent really bad. And so just as you would with a kind of an environmental project or renewable energy project, you are measuring and you're marking those resources around emissions reductions. How can you use those resources and tie them and focus on the results that matter most? And so when we look at the environmental sector and employment, I think within the kind of agricultural sector, there are a lot of opportunities to both have meaningful environmental impact. And environmental impact does include emissions reductions, but it's not only emissions reductions. And I think part of what's been lost is the value of nature-based solutions, which is a $1.5 trillion market of biodiversity assets that provide both income, livelihoods, and employment opportunities for many people in developing countries and emerging markets. And so the challenge with those types of assets is sometimes nature is worth more dead than alive. And so through different types of financing structures, how can you value those assets, finance them, potentially either rehabilitate certain degraded areas, agricultural lands, incentivize farmers to adopt new types of agricultural practices, regenerative agriculture, but value the environmental and sometimes the employment benefit that's kind of an outcome of that, and measure it. And if you can quantify it and you can measure it, then you can create a new investment dynamic to where a certain asset or type of project wasn't bankable before and suddenly becomes more bankable. And I think going back to your initial question around, does this generate the returns? I think the interesting piece of this is you do have a spectrum of investor types, and some of which are quite keen to blend their resources with more commercial institutional investors if they can have the measurable environmental and employment impact. And I think all this comes back to this wider point that Richard made, was it's really important that at the national and country level, what is it that the problem you're trying to solve for and the results that you want to achieve? And as countries think about their need to transition toward a low carbon economy, it's really an opportunities lens. And for them, how do you finance that transition and create the opportunities for inclusive employment? And then those opportunities are not just employment opportunities in the green sector. It also may be transitioning from the brown sector towards the green sector, and vice versa. And so there's a range of opportunities, and I think it's just starting. And I think the impact bonds are being used a lot in the social sector. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build on that history and start to think about what's good about them that can be adopted into environmental financing, while at the same time tailoring those financing structures towards the specific type of project you're financing. Because in the environmental sector, what's different is oftentimes you do have revenue. So if you're providing TVET services, oftentimes those are services provided to people that don't want to pay for those services. So it's a government paying for those services. And so therefore your revenue source as an investor is the outcomes contract. In the environmental sector, you may be able to invest in sustainable agricultural practices that enable a farmer to repay a loan. And all you're really talking about is how do you bridge that financing gap with a performance incentive for the incremental environmental impact. And so there's the message here is really the fit for purpose financing.
Okay. I'd like then, as we close, to get your views on the level of collaboration and how much room countries that I think the argument has been made who should really focus on driving the solutions from a local level should leave for collaboration, because message that we have heard in the past 2 days was the need for partnerships. So how does that work? How does that balance of partnering, but also being the driver of your local solution work in your view, Richard?
Sound like a record with the needle stuck now, Fifi. But the answer is to focus on outcomes. If you look for it, if you attempt to introduce a program that has been designed elsewhere, designed in Washington, imposed on the country, it won't fit. If you say, I'm looking for an outcome, you enable an environment of flexibility and innovation for the solution to be grown locally, from the bottom up. And in creating that solution from the bottom up, it also can drive partnership, because to deliver my solution, I'm going to have to partner with different people. Now, your challenge as government at a strategic level is going to be to bring the strategic partners together around that objective, because they're used to prescribing inputs. They think they have the solutions for you. You don't want to import their solutions. You want them to buy into your outcomes and then for those solutions to develop upwards.
Is that your view? And perhaps if you can just add that, you know, what you'd advise the international players looking to scale up skills development programs, particularly in developing nations, what you'd advise those players?
So I think, as Richard was saying, the localization of this is paramount, and the country-driven processes are paramount. And so the first level of that is moving from, in which we still see a lot of this kind of designing programs in Washington or London, and then trying to then impose them on a country. When we think about these types of programs, outcomes-based contracts, funding may come from the UK government or may come from the World Bank, but at the end of the day, it has to be the national government or the local governments that are really defining what is success, because it's those entities, democratic processes that represent their citizens and should have the long-term policy perspective around what is it that they're trying to actually achieve. They may need support, but it's from that. Governments should be really good at defining what social or policy outcomes they want. They're not so good at figuring out how to get them. And I think that's where the opportunity here is really local governments and domestic governments with support of actors like UNIDO, helping define what are the outcomes that matter most, but then letting the local communities, the private sector, civil society figure out the best way to achieve them in the most cost-effective way, and adapt and innovate and collect data, just as any private company would do. When we think about the skilling sector, it translates very much into this, and I think the skilling sector is very important because, particularly in these times of COVID, you have high rates of unemployment. Governments are always terrified about low unemployment rates. They spend lots of money on it. They spend it poorly. And so with governments, I think there is an opportunity to start to think about these types of contracts, and impact bonds are one of them. We are seeing, for instance, even a case in Asia right now that we're working with that are rolling out an impact bond on the skilling sector within the COVID context, and they're rapidly doing it. But the advice we have for all governments and partners is, one, focus on what is your theory of change. So is it to save money because you're gonna get people employed and maybe reduce tax dollars? Maybe, but if that doesn't happen, is that really why you should do it? Or is it because you're spending lots of money and you don't think you're getting the right outcomes, and regardless of savings or whatever, just the better value for money is what you care about, or you wanna support policy innovation? And I think having clear why you wanna finance it this way is critical, because if not, the whole thing starts to unravel. The second thing is really think about the transformation, not just the transaction. And so we have a case in Colombia where we did an initial impact bond project on the skilling sector, small project, but the vision was, how can the government roll this into a much wider policy agenda? And so the government in Colombia took that initial example and now is implementing it through a much larger national level fund on skilling. And so the transaction costs of that transition start to make a lot more sense if, as a local government, you have that vision, as well as it enables governments to also build the partnerships, the non-traditional partnerships with the private sector, because the private sector all of a sudden doesn't see a $500,000 project. They see potentially a market that they're willing to invest and do something differently because they see that long-term vision. And so those would be my advice to governments. And I don't know if that resonates similarly with Richard.
No, it does. It does. Certainly it does. And gentlemen, you, Zach and Richard, thank you so much for those insights. I usually have quite a lot to add. I think you guys have said it all this time. Thank you.